I'm Corel Painter Master Aaron Rutten, and today we're going to be painting butter. I'll start by creating a sketch using the Detail Oils brush. I'm drawing in 2-point perspective here. I just want to draw a long cube shape. I've drawn that sketch on a separate layer. Now I'll create a new layer beneath the sketch, and I'll start blocking in my main butter shape here using a yellow color. I'll change my background color to something a bit darker to make it easier to see that yellow, but that doesn't have to be my final background color. In order to keep the lines straight, I'm going to use straight line drawing mode. And it's okay if the edges don't match up with the sketch exactly, because I can always change this shape later to clean it up. If I create a closed shape, I can select the paint bucket and fill in the middle here. I'll increase the opacity of my sketch layer so that I can see it against those edges of the yellow. I'm going to select the pinch brush, and this is going to pull the pixels in toward the center of the brush, which essentially lets me sculpt or reshape my edge here. So I'm just painting right along the edge back and forth to shape it into the shape that I want. I'll hide that sketch layer, and I'll just go through and clean it up a bit more. Next, we'll make the butter look three-dimensional by adding a shadow side. I'm going to select layer content on that butter silhouette. Then I'm going to create a new layer above it. Then I'll use the polygonal lasso to subtract from that selection on the light side of the butter. The layer for the shadow side will be set to a multiply composite method. I'll just choose kind of a orangish yellow color that looks like a nice shadow. And I can hunt around for the exact color that I want until I get just that. I'll be sure to name that layer shadow side. That way if I have a lot of layers, I don't get mixed up. We want the corners of the shadows to be rounded to match the corners of the butter, so I'll just go ahead and round those using the pinch brush. I'll create a new layer above the shadow. I'll get a selection of the butter silhouette, and then I'll use that to trap my paint inside that shape. And with the scratchboard tool and a lighter yellow color, I'll just paint right along the edges of those shapes, because those sharp corners will be reflecting a lot of light. I'll also create another new layer, and that will be for the lightest, brightest side, which will be the end here. I'll just make that a bit lighter. Next, I'll add in some cracks and details on the butter. I'll do that on a separate layer called cracks. I'm going to select kind of a bright reddish orange color, because this butter is translucent and the light will be going through it. And kind of like your ears or your nose, you'll be able to see kind of a reddish color glowing through. In order to help those cracks look three-dimensional, I'm going to put a highlight on the side that's facing toward the light. Details like this will take your butter to the next level. I'll add some glossiness to the lighter side of the butter using a lighter yellow color. With a very fine brush, I'll add a few little wrinkles near the edges here. I am painting from reference, so I have kind of an idea of what butter should look like. Next, let's add a shadow cast from the butter onto the ground. I'll just use the polygonal lasso to follow the edges underneath the butter and just create a little bit of a dark area that I'll set to multiply and then fill with kind of a dark brown. I'm not entirely happy with the color of the shadow side of the butter, so I'm going to adjust that using an effect and just try to get it maybe a bit more orange and a bit lighter. I think that looks pretty good. I might lighten up the top side of the butter as well. We'll do that using the digital airbrush and a lighter yellow. I'll also use the digital airbrush to add some environment color to the bottom edge of both the shadow side and the light side of the butter. I can help those corners kind of curve over by painting along those with the airbrush too. Let's also use the airbrush to just change the color of the shadow a bit, because in some areas it might be lighter or darker. I've added a layer mask to the shadow layer, and I'm just painting with black to fade that shadow and make it more transparent in some areas. Then I can kind of tweak the color a bit by making it a little bit red-orange in some areas and darker in others. I'll add some brighter highlights along the edges using the smooth scratch board and an even lighter, almost white yellow color. Then I'm going to use a technique where I copy merged, which means that I merge all of my layers together, copy them, and paste them to a single layer. But I'm also able to preserve my original layers just by grouping them. As you can see, I have this merged layer with all the butter layers, but I also have a group with all of my individual layers, should I ever need them again. Next, I'll convert that merged layer into a thick paint layer so I can paint on it with the thick paint brushes. And I'm going to use some of my thick paint brushes to thicken this up. I'll choose Broken Paint Flat, and then just sample colors that I already put down and paint over them. And this is going to add some thick, lumpy paint. If I press down really hard, I can make the paint thicker. If I press down lightly, I can kind of scrape it away. And I don't want to overdo it here. I want to follow the directions and contours of the butter. I want to make sure not to accidentally cover up my reflection or any of my cracks or crevices. This brush is great because it has a flat dab, and I can rotate that dab using the Wacom Art Pen to really get a lot of interesting shapes. I can create texture by scumbling. I'll just use light pressure, and that helps the paint just break off in a few areas rather than creating a continuous stroke. Some of the corners are kind of flattened here, so I'm just adding a tiny bit of shadow to those. I'll add a little bit of a brighter, more saturated yellow. And I want this to look just a little bit more exciting than a real stick of butter, but I don't want to go too wild with the colors. I'll use Broken Paint Flat just to touch up some of those cracks and crevices as well. As I'm painting, I like to zoom out and evaluate the painting from far away. I think it's looking pretty good, but I do want to blend away some of that depth so it's not so chunky. I'll do that using the Smooth Knife blender. I'll also blend a bit with Just Add Water, but I want to go ahead and remove the depth from the impasto. This way I'm only blending the color and I'm not adding any depth. Now I'll apply that layer mask I created for the shadow, and I'll just blend it a little bit using Diffuse Blur. That softens the edges up. I also like to flip the painting horizontally to evaluate it. That helps me see mistakes sometimes. Now I'll want to use the Distorto brush just to distort this and add some details. As you can see, I can make the edges look a little bit more irregular. Painting realistically is all about observation, so you really have to spend time studying your reference photo and looking for these little details. As you may have noticed, as I'm going through this, I'm kind of grouping things into categories. I'm doing all the shadows together, all the cracks together, all the highlights together, and I'm thinking about each of those as a component of the painting. Now I'm ready to change my background color to a more final color. For now it's going to be white, but I might tweak that a bit. I'm going to go to that shadow layer and just clean that up with a digital airbrush just to make it blend in with the white a lot better. I'm adding in some really dark reds and kind of red orangish colors. I think I'll tone the background just a little bit darker, so I'll use a light gray that's almost white. Then I'll add a layer called Texture. In the Papers panel, I'll select a paper texture that looks like a canvas. Then I'll fill that layer with a neutral gray color that is 128 for the value, 0 for the hue and saturation. And I'll set the composite method of that layer to overlay. Then if I go to Effects, Surface Control, Apply Surface Texture, it's going to add a surface texture as an overlay layer. I may need to tone that background to be able to see that texture a little bit better, but that texture is separate. If I add a mask to it, select black and the sponge, then I can kind of mask away some of that so it's not so uniform. You can see I'm just kind of painting over it repeatedly. And that leaves me with a nice texture that helps this look like a traditional painting. I'll select the Smooth Palette Knife and I'll add some more finer details. The Smooth Palette Knife is one of my favorite brushes because it can add paint and blend at the same time. If you start painting, you're going to add paint and it'll eventually run out, and then you'll only be blending. If you want to add paint again, you just lift your pen up. Now I'm adding these details on a separate layer, that way if I mess something up, I'm not ruining all of that nice butter that I already painted. And then when I decide I'm happy with those changes, I'll just go ahead and merge that layer down with the butter to apply it. Next I want to create kind of a focal effect. I'm going to duplicate that thick paint butter layer. I'll hide the top example, and the bottom example I will blur a bit using Effects Focus Soften and the circular mode. I'll show that top layer again. I'll add a layer mask to it, select black and the digital airbrush, and then paint along the edges to put them out of focus. Next I'll select the Detail Oils brush. I'll merge those butter layers together. I'll just call that layer butter, and then I can go through and just add a few more smaller details. These are very, very fine details with a small brush. I'll also add some gradients here and there just to smooth out some of those edges using the digital airbrush. I have Preserve Transparency on so I'm not accidentally painting onto my background. I'll brighten up that orangish color on the butter a bit to help it look more translucent. It's amazing how something as simple as a stick of butter can have so much detail. I'm getting near the end of this painting, so I'm going to save an iteration, and I'm going to flip it horizontally to evaluate it. I think it's looking pretty good. I want to evaluate the grayscale version of this. This will help me see if all of my lights and darks are well balanced. I feel like the very lightest side needs to be obviously lighter, so I'm going to lighten that up a bit. I'll use select layer content to get a selection of the silhouette of the butter, and then use the lasso just to kind of take a chunk out of that. Then I'll create a new layer and paint on it with white. I'll set the composite method to screen and reduce the opacity until it's just lightening it enough to be noticeable but not over lightening it. I'll flip my canvas back, and I'm really just adding as much detail as I can from my reference image at this point. It helps to just focus on very, very small areas of your reference image, like this little crease in the butter. I'm spending a lot of time on that crease. Since this is a fairly simple object, as far as its fundamental three-dimensional shape, I really have to go in and make all these little details stand out and look interesting. Otherwise, this butter would look just like anyone else's stick of butter if it didn't have any character. When you're painting realistically, it can be challenging to make your painting look like a painting and not a photo. And that's really what I'm aiming for here. I want it to look realistic. I want people to look at this and go, wow, it looks like realistic butter. But at the same time, it has a painterly feel to it and it looks like art. Because otherwise people might look at it and be like, okay, you took a picture of a stick of butter. What's the deal with that? You also have to decide how much detail is too much. How much detail do you really want to put into something like this? This is just kind of a silly painting to do, so I wanted to make it look realistic, but I'm not going to spend weeks on butter. When you get near the end of the painting, you start to get into the 80-20 rule. That means that 20% of your effort will achieve 80% of your results, but the last 20% of detail will take another 80% effort. If we look at an earlier state of this painting, you can see that it has enough detail to communicate what the painting is about. It looks like butter. But from that point on, I'm not really adding very much. The brush strokes are pretty small, the details are really small, and it's just fine little textures and cracks and crevices and things that add character. And I could keep going and going and going on this and just spend forever. You could zoom into this and see every little molecule of butter, but I don't think I want to take it to that level. I think this is pretty good. I'm satisfied with how it looks, and so I'm going to call this a finished painting. I hope you enjoyed this painting of butter. If you did, be sure to subscribe to this channel if you're not subscribed already, and thanks to my members who make videos like this possible.